It's 1976, the election, and Jimmy Carter's presidency. 76 was the Bicentennial. Many celebrations were held, but for some, there is very little turnout. There is little hope in the nation at this time, as folks are discouraged by politics and politicians. They're disappointed in the nation's declining image abroad. They're disillusioned by the institutions which were to keep people in check and expand democracy. So this election in 76 is Gerald Ford versus Jimmy Carter. Ford was Nixon's vice president. He was the first person to become president who was not elected as president or vice president. The second, of course, would be Frank Underwood. 2 points if you get that reference. So it's Nixon's vice president against a populist Georgia peanut farmer. What are the main issues? The economy, of course. Watergate, hanging over the heads of the Republicans. Now, Ronald Reagan challenged Ford for the Republican nomination. Nixon told Ford not to worry, that Reagan was a, quote, lightweight and not someone to be considered seriously or feared. Ha! The real kick was Barry Goldwater endorsed Ford. He still held credibility among the conservative wing of the party, and his endorsement helped Ford somehow capture the nomination. Carter won the nomination as a representative of the new moderate wing of the Democratic Party. He was a Southern governor. He self-consciously sought to reorient the party away from runaway liberalism. He promised he would, quote, never tell a lie to the American people. Thereby, he emphasized the corruption of Watergate and its cover-up. He trumpeted himself as an outsider. Does this sound familiar? He was outwardly Christian. He was a born-again Christian, which was very popular during the 70s. And he played on this religious revivalism of the 1970s to garner more support. Carter revived and took advantage of the New Deal coalition. Now, the New Deal coalition was comprised of Southern whites, African Americans, labor, ethnic groups, and it eked out a victory. He swept the South, except for Virginia, like almost all Democrats have done since the Civil War. This is why we call it the Solid South. Now, there was low voter turnout. One reporter stated, neither Ford nor Carter won as many votes as Mr. Nobody. Almost half the eligible voters stayed home. Why? Watergate, the economy, lackluster candidates, and again, a lot of disillusionment among the American populace. So who is Jimmy Carter? He tried to be honest. He tried to be the everyman president. For example, he did not ride in a limousine after inauguration, but he walked down Pennsylvania Avenue, which is kind of interesting, and you can find those images on the interwebs if you look it up. He was an outsider. He did not hire a bunch of D.C. insiders for his staff and cabinet, but this alienated many, and their inexperience limited their competence. As a man of faith, he claimed that he prayed for guidance 25 times a day. Imagine somebody doing that today. But this often led to indecision and changing of his mind. Now, he was inexperienced. He tried to tackle too many things. He constantly moralized the American people, which was not what the country needed at the time. They needed hope and optimism. Historians argue that too much was asked of him, that no president could help turn the economy around, restore international faith in the U.S., and lift the spirits of the people. But the next president did. He restored control of the Panama Canal to Panama. This was much debated, but it was supported by many on both sides. He limited or ended aid to nations with human rights abuses. He was selective in his enforcement, for example, Iran, but this is substantial. Now, probably Carter's greatest achievement was the peace that he achieved in the Middle East. Now, this was limited, but it is significant. In 1978, we have the Camp David Accords, and these were signed in September of 78, and they were concluded in March of 1979. This resulted in mutual recognition of Israel and Egypt. This was a general framework for a larger peace, with Carter hoping that this agreement would lead all the major parties back to the peace negotiations that had been interrupted in the 60s by the Yom Kippur War. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat were the two main players. Now, this agreement would hold larger ramifications down the road, especially for Sadat. He would be assassinated 3 years later. The plotters claim that these Camp David Accords were the reason for it. There is video of that assassination available on the internet. You can find it. It is quite disturbing, and it shows the whole thing go down. So that is his foreign policy. achievement, a solid one, no doubt. Limited, but a great first step. Now, he gives his crisis of confidence speech, which we're going to get to in a few minutes, but this time is considered one of malaise. There is a general lack of faith in the government. There is a lack of faith in the future. There is a lack of faith in American institutions. Why? Number one, stagflation. What is stagflation? Stagflation is a combination of high inflation and high unemployment. Generally, it was argued that these two were polar forces. If high inflation, that meant people were spending and there were jobs. If there was high unemployment, people were not spending money and thus prices would go down. But this confluence hit in the 1970s, severely damaging the American economy as well as the American psyche. Under Ford, inflation rose to 11%. Under Carter, it would approach 20%. He tried tax and spending cuts. This didn't work. A second issue that we see involved in this malaise is the energy crisis. Israel defeated the Arab nations in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And who started this war? The Arabs. Egypt and Syrian forces launched coordinated attacks on Israel during the holiday of Yom Kippur. And as always happens when the Arabs attack Israel, Israel wins. OPEC nations were upset. They would install an oil embargo. This led to long lines at the gas pump. This embargo impacts not simply the price of oil, but any goods that require oil or gasoline for transport. Thus, we see the rising prices. The embargo was eventually lifted, but OPEC continued to raise prices, leading to a tripling of the price of gasoline between 1970 and 1980. Again, that is quite significant. Now, getting to the crisis of confidence speech, hopefully you've had a chance to view that. Prior to this speech, many Democrats had grown frustrated, and the American people were facing economic and energy crises. There was a lot of unhappiness. So what did Carter do? He holed up at his presidential retreat near Camp David for 2 weeks, keeping the media at bay, meditating, and asking different leaders for advice. Now, one of the great quotes from this speech, and which I agree with, all the legislation in the world cannot fix what is wrong with America. Absolutely true. But what did he propose? To effect change, legislation. Now, in this speech, he warns against the fragmentation of the American people. He is worried about energy issues, the search for independence, this loss of confidence. He is honest here about the problems, but he does not take any real responsibility. As one of his quotes reads, many questioned his leadership at the time. He was weak in many ways, and the Iranian hostage crisis would bear this out a short time later. Again, in the speech, you hear him admit that the people have told him what they want is leadership. Now, if the problem is the way the Americans view the government, can the government be the answer to this said problem? Another quote, this is not a message of happiness or reassurance, but it is the truth and it is a warning. In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now worship self-indulgence and consumption. So again, here is the moralizing that Carter did. This is not what the American people wanted to hear. They're disillusioned. They're upset. They're uneasy. They want some reassurance. They don't want to be lectured about how they're wrong. But again, in this quote, he argues that we now worship at the altar of consumption, but again, this is not too much consumption, as 10% of Americans didn't even have jobs, and those who did were barely able to afford the bare necessities. Inflation, remember? He was honest, but he was quite preachy and quite condescending. He was pessimistic. He was not inspiring. Again, this is not what the people needed to hear at the time. A Phoenix newspaper editorial the next day said, the nation did not tune in to Carter last night to hear a sermon. It wanted answers, and it did not get them. One of his aides even told him, quote, leadership is the single biggest weakness in the public's perception of you. You are seen to be weak, providing no sense of direction, unsure of yourself about where you want to lead the country. Now, things would actually get worse for Carter. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. This nullified the previous peace accord with the Soviets, as this clearly demonstrated their desire to stay on the aggressive side. Some argue this war played a part in bringing down the Soviet government, and this is a strong argument. But again, this refutes the previous détente that we had had. We've discussed terrorism, and terror would take over especially hard in 1979 with regard to the United States. This is when we see the beginning of the Iranian hostage crisis. Earlier, we spoke of the U.S. involvement in Iran during the Cold War. We placed the Shah in power, essentially, and this would come back to haunt us a couple decades later. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard toppled the Shah's government and rallied around the Ayatollah Khomeini, a fundamentalist Muslim religious leader who symbolized orthodox Islamic values. He hated the United States since 1953, when we took down Mossad and installed the Shah. Carter allowed the Shah into the U.S. for treatment of cancer at this time. This led to frenzied mobs of Iranian youths storming and taking control of the American embassy in Tehran. They seized the diplomats and the staff. They took 52 Americans as hostages. Khomeini demanded the U.S. return the Shah and all of his wealth in exchange for the hostages. Carter did not act. He went to the UN for help. Khomeini didn't care. He scoffed at UN requests. The UN, toothless. Carter then froze all Iranian assets in the United States and asked allies for trade embargo of Iran. But because of oil, this embargo was quite limited. He did try one secret mission to rescue the hostages. It failed miserably and 8 died. There was nightly news coverage. This was actually when Nightline originated, and every day Americans saw blindfolded Americans being paraded like circus animals for the rest of the world to see. This was humiliating. This made Americans feel even worse, and again, it brings us down even lower. After 444 days, Carter decided to release several $1 billion of Iranian assets to ransom the kidnapped hostages, and they were finally freed. This was the legacy of Carter's presidency. Many remember the Iranian hostage crisis. I remember it. I was a kid at the time, but it was scary. It was frightening. It was depressing, and it bothered me to no end, and I was just a little kid. But again, this shows kind of the weakness that the United States had on the international level at the time. It showed the weakness of Carter as a leader. Again, he did great things with the Camp David Accords, but beyond that, he was just not able to establish himself. In 1980, he would run for president again, and he would run up against a guy named Ronald Reagan. And we'll get to him in the next